Welcome, dear viewers. For more thrilling and exclusive stories every week, become a member. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy your coffee. On July 4th, 2012, Geneva's sky flickered as if reality itself had glitched. Only a handful of scientists knew the truth. Deep beneath the surface, in a chamber called Level 9, a portal had opened for exactly 13 seconds. The next morning, the project was erased from every record, but some say if you listen near the old access shaft, you can still hear the echoes of what came through. I wasn't supposed to be there when they found me. Hell, I wasn't supposed to exist at all, according to the European Organization for Nuclear Research Employment database. But there I was, 3 weeks ago, unconscious in the cafeteria of Building 40 at 4:47 a.m., wearing a lab coat that didn't belong to me and clutching a keycard for floors that officially don't exist. My name is Thomas Kellner, and I used to fix elevators for a living. Simple job. Predictable. Cable snaps. You replace it. Door won't close. You adjust the sensors. Nothing that couldn't be solved with the right tools and enough coffee. That was before I answered an ad for specialized maintenance technician, unique underground facility, posted on a job board in Meyrin. The pay was stupid good, enough to finally move out of my cramped studio apartment above the bakery on Rue de Lyon. The interview was weird from the start. No office building, just a parking garage beneath a medical supply company. A guy named Henrik Johansson, thin as a rail with nervous eyes, handed me a tablet and told me to sign 17 different non-disclosure agreements. When I asked what exactly I'd be maintaining, he just smiled and said, "Vertical transportation systems in a research environment." I should have walked away when he mentioned the psychological evaluation, or when they drew blood for security clearance purposes. But rent was due in 2 weeks, and my savings account looked like a sick joke. The first day, Henrik drove me to what looked like a service entrance near CERN's main campus. No signs, no official markings. Just a concrete door with a numeric keypad and a retinal scanner that seemed way too advanced for maintenance work. Inside, the corridor stretched down at a steep angle, lined with pipes that hummed with electricity. The air tasted metallic, like licking a battery. "You'll be working the night shift," Henrik explained as we descended, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The equipment you'll be servicing is sensitive to electromagnetic interference during peak operational hours. That's when I first heard it, a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the walls themselves, not mechanical, something else, something that made my teeth ache. Henrik stopped at an elevator I'd never seen before. No call buttons, no floor indicator, just a panel that required his keycard and a handprint scan. "Welcome to your new workplace, Thomas," he said as the doors slid open to reveal a shaft that descended into perfect darkness. "Try not to think too hard about what you see down there." The elevator dropped for what felt like minutes. The elevator's descent felt endless. My ears popped twice before Henrik handed me a laminated card. "Operational guidelines," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the cramped space. "Read them carefully. Your life depends on following them exactly." I squinted at the card under the dim overhead light. Maintenance protocols, sub-level assignments, classification, restricted. 1. Never enter any corridor marked with red tape between midnight and 3 a.m. 2. If you hear humming from behind sealed doors, walk away immediately. 3. The service elevator only responds to your keycard. Do not attempt manual override. 4th, report any temperature anomalies exceeding 15 degrees Celsius variance to Supervisor Johansson. 5. Avoid direct eye contact with any personnel wearing unmarked lab coats. What the fuck is this? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Henrik's laugh sounded forced. Insurance policy. The facility has some unique environmental challenges. These guidelines keep our maintenance staff safe. The elevator lurched to a stop. When the doors opened, I stepped into a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie. The walls were polished steel, interrupted by massive conduits that pulsed with blue light. The ceiling arched high above us, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move on their own. "This is sub-level 7, Henrik said, checking his watch. "Your primary work zone. The elevators here service research labs, storage areas, and administrative offices. Nothing too complicated. We walked past doors marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Not language, but something that hurt to look at directly. The vibration I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, coming up through the floor like a massive heartbeat. What kind of research happens down here, I asked. Particle physics, advanced theoretical work, above your pay grade and mine. Henrik stopped at a maintenance closet and handed me a toolkit. Your shift starts in an hour. I'll show you the equipment. The elevators were unlike anything I'd worked on. No cables, no counterweights. They moved on magnetic rails with precision that seemed impossible. Each shaft was marked with a letter number combination. A 7, B7, C7. Normal enough. The important thing, Henrik said, opening the control panel for elevator A7, is that these systems are integrated with the research equipment. Any maintenance during active experiments could cause complications. What kind of complications? He was quiet for too long. The kind that void your insurance policy. Henrik left me alone with 3 elevators to monitor and a logbook filled with maintenance records dating back only 3 months. Every entry was in different handwriting. I counted 17 different signatures. For a place that supposedly employed dozens of technicians, I hadn't seen another maintenance worker since arriving. My first 4 hours passed without incident. I adjusted the door sensors on elevator B7, replaced a worn guide rail on C7, and ran diagnostic tests that all came back green. The work was straightforward, almost boring. Then the humming started. It came from somewhere deeper in the facility, a sound like massive machinery spinning up. But this wasn't mechanical. It had an organic quality, like breathing. The vibration in the walls intensified until my tools rattled on the workbench. I checked my watch, nearly midnight. The humming grew louder, seeming to come from behind every door at once. I remembered the guidelines. If you hear humming from behind sealed doors, walk away immediately. But I was in a corridor. The humming was everywhere. The lights flickered. Not electrical malfunction, but something else. For a moment, the blue pulse in the conduits faltered, and I saw something impossible. The shadows on the walls weren't shadows at all. They were moving independently, reaching toward the light sources like living things. Then elevator A7 chimed. The call hadn't come from any floor button. According to the display, someone had summoned it from sub-level 9. I stared at the panel. There was no sub-level 9 button. The lowest floor marked was sub-level 8. The elevator descended anyway. I grabbed my toolkit and ran to the shaft access panel. Through the reinforced glass, I watched the elevator car disappear into a section of the building that shouldn't exist. The display showed impossible readings, depth measurements that would put us nearly a kilometer underground. The humming stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something else. Voices. Multiple people talking in a language that sounded like static mixed with whispers. The conversation was coming through the elevator's communication system. Against every instinct, I pressed the intercom button. "Hello? This is maintenance. Is everything all right down there?" The voices stopped instantly, then one voice answered, clear as daylight. "Thomas, we've been waiting for you." The voice was mine, my exact voice, speaking words I'd never said. The elevator was coming back up. I yanked the emergency brake, killing power to all 3 units. The facility's backup generators kicked in, bathing everything in red emergency lighting. My radio crackled, Henrik's voice, distorted by static. "Thomas, report to the surface immediately. We're experiencing a containment issue." But I'd left my radio in the maintenance closet. The voice was coming from elevator A7's speaker system. The elevator wasn't moving, but something was still rising in the shaft. I could hear it, not mechanical movement, but something climbing the walls. Something that breathed with the same rhythm as the facility's vibrations. I backed away from the shaft, clutching the maintenance protocols. 5 simple rules that suddenly felt like prayers. The red emergency lighting began to pulse in sync with whatever was ascending towards sub-level 7. And somewhere in the darkness above, footsteps echoed in corridors that should have been empty. The footsteps stopped directly above my head. I stood motionless in the red emergency lighting, toolkit heavy in my sweating hands. The facility's ventilation system had gone silent, leaving only the distant hum of generators and my own ragged breathing. Then the ceiling panel shifted. Not violently, just a subtle movement like someone testing whether it was secure. A few specks of dust drifted down, visible in the crimson glow. I needed to get out of this corridor. Rule 1 echoed in my memory. Never enter any corridor marked with red tape between midnight and 3 a.m. But what about staying in one when something was hunting you from above? Moving slowly, I backed toward the maintenance closet. Each step seemed impossibly loud on the metal flooring. The ceiling panel shifted again, more deliberately this time. My radio crackled, the real one clipped to my belt. "Thomas, respond immediately," Henrik's voice tight with panic. "Emergency protocols are in effect. You need to evacuate to sub-level 6. I unclipped the radio, keeping my eyes on the ceiling. "Henrik, something's in the elevator shaft. A 7 went to a floor that doesn't exist." Static filled the channel for several seconds. When Henrik's voice returned, it sounded different, strained, like he was speaking through clenched teeth. "Thomas, there is no sub-level 9. You're experiencing altitude sickness from the descent. Proceed to sub-level 6 immediately." Altitude sickness, 300 meters underground. "Henrik, I heard voices. Someone was using my voice through the intercom system." "Thomas," his tone shifted, becoming oddly formal. "Please confirm your current location." I looked around the corridor. No identification markers anywhere. I'm on sub-level 7, near the maintenance station." "Negative, there is no maintenance station on sub-level 7. The radio went dead. I checked the facility map posted near the elevator bank. According to the diagram, sub-level 7 contained storage areas and a break room. No maintenance station, no elevator repair workshop. But I was standing in a fully equipped maintenance area that shouldn't exist. The ceiling panel above me creaked. I ran. The corridor stretched much farther than I remembered. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, creating shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. Behind me, something heavy dropped to the floor with a wet thud. I didn't look back. At the end of the corridor, I found an emergency stairwell marked "Evacuation Route, sub-levels 6 to 8. The sign was wrong. It should have read 6 to 7. There was no sub-level 8 on any official diagram. The stairwell door required a keycard. Mine worked, but the scanner beeped 3 times, an error code I'd never heard before. The door opened anyway. Inside, the stairs descended into darkness that the emergency lighting couldn't penetrate. Each step down felt like walking into thick water. The air grew warmer, then suddenly cold enough to see my breath. On the landing marked sub-level 6, I found Henrik waiting for me. He stood with his back to the stairs, facing a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." His lab coat was pristine white, unmarked, which triggered another rule from the guidelines. Rule 5. Avoid direct eye contact with personnel wearing unmarked lab coats. "Henrik," I called from the stairs. He turned around and I understood why the rule existed. His face was Henrik's face, but wrong in every detail that mattered. The nose sat slightly off-center. One eye was a fraction larger than the other. His smile contained the right number of teeth, but they were arranged like someone had tried to rebuild a mouth from memory. "Thomas," he said, his voice perfectly normal. "I'm glad you made it safely." I kept my eyes focused on the wall behind him. "What's happening down here?" "Equipment malfunction, nothing serious. We need you to perform an emergency repair on sub-level 9. "You just told me there was no sub-level 9. The thing wearing Henrik's face tilted its head, too far, like an owl. "I never said that. You must be confused from the atmospheric pressure changes." Something warm and wet was spreading across my palm. I looked down and realized I'd been gripping my toolkit so tightly that the metal handle had cut through my skin. "The repair is urgent," not Henrik continued. "We have a containment breach in the main laboratory. Your expertise with vertical transportation systems is required." "I fix elevators. I don't know anything about containment." "Oh, but you do." Its smile widened, showing too much gum. "You've been fixing our particular elevator problem for longer than you remember." I backed up a step. What do you mean? Check your wallet, Thomas. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my wallet. Inside, where my driver's license should have been, I found an identification card I'd never seen before. European Organization for Nuclear Research Clearance Level 9. Name, Thomas Kellner. Department, Sub-Level Maintenance Employed. Since July 5th, 2012. The photo was definitely me, but I looked younger, much younger, and I was wearing the same lab coat as Not Henrik. That's impossible, I whispered. I was hired 3 weeks ago. Time works differently down here. Not Henrik stepped closer. Especially near the main laboratory. Some of our research involves temporal mechanics. I studied the ID card. The employment date was July 5th, 2012, one day after the date mentioned in those stories about Geneva's sky flickering. But that was over a decade ago. I would have been in high school. You're lying. Am I? Not Henrik gestured to the door behind him. Would you like to see the laboratory? Perhaps it will help you remember. The door's security panel was already flashing green, waiting for me to enter. The containment breach, I said. What exactly is contained down there? Something that came through 13 seconds too early. Not Henrik's voice took on an edge of genuine concern. Something that's been trying to return ever since. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I was curious. The ID card felt real in my hands. The employment date aligned too perfectly with the stories I'd heard about CERN's secret experiments. If I go down there, I said, what happens? You do what you've always done. You fix the elevator. And if I refuse? Not Henrik's face shifted, features rearranging themselves into something more honest. Then you wake up in Building 40's cafeteria tomorrow morning, clutching a key card for floors that don't exist. Just like you did 3 weeks ago, and the week before that, and every week since we found you. The corridor around us seemed to stretch and contract, like breathing. The emergency lighting flickered in patterns that reminded me of a heartbeat monitor. How many times have we had this conversation? I asked. 47. Not Henrik's voice carried genuine sadness now. You always choose the same thing. You always go down to fix the elevator. And something always goes wrong. I looked at the ID card again. In the bottom corner, barely visible, was a timestamp. Issued, July 5th, 2012, 3:47:33 GMT. The exact moment, according to the stories, when the portal had closed. What am I fixing down there? The door, Not Henrik said simply. The door that should have stayed closed. Behind the authorization panel, machinery hummed to life. The door began to slide open, revealing an elevator shaft that descended into absolute darkness. But this wasn't like the maintenance elevators upstairs. This was something organic, walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. This is your choice, Thomas, Not Henrik said. Fix the elevator and remember who you really are. Or wake up tomorrow and live this week all over again. The elevator car was rising from the depths, but I could see through its transparent walls that it wasn't empty. Something was inside, pressing against the glass with hands that had too many fingers. And it was smiling with my face. The elevator car rose steadily through the organic shaft, and I could see more details through its transparent walls. The thing inside wasn't quite human. It had my face, but the proportions were subtly wrong, like a photograph that had been stretched. Its fingers pressed against the glass, leaving marks that looked suspiciously like condensation from warm breath. That's you, Not Henrik said, watching my reaction carefully. From the first loop, before you understood what needed to be done. What happened to him? He tried to leave. The containment protocol disagreed with that decision. The elevator stopped at our level with a soft chime that sounded distinctly biological. The doors didn't open immediately. Instead, they seemed to flex, like eyelids preparing to blink. Thomas, Not Henrik continued, you need to understand something. When the portal opened in 2012, it wasn't an accident. We were trying to access parallel dimensional states, different versions of reality running alongside our own. I stared at the motionless elevator. And We succeeded. Too well. For 13 seconds, we had a stable connection to a reality where CERN never existed, where the Large Hadron Collider was never built, where you... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Where you were a theoretical physicist instead of a maintenance worker. The elevator doors finally opened. The interior looked normal enough. Polished steel, standard button panel, emergency phone. But the air that drifted out carried scents that didn't belong underground. Pine trees, summer rain, something that might have been flowers. The other version of you came through during those 13 seconds, Not Henrik explained, displaced from his reality into ours. We've been trying to send him back ever since. I looked at the ID card again. So I'm not really Thomas Kellner? You are, just not the Thomas who belongs in this dimension. Your memories, your life, your job as an elevator repair technician, those all belong to the Thomas who should be here. But he's trapped over there, in your reality, probably just as confused as you've been. The thing inside the elevator had stopped moving entirely. It stood perfectly still, watching us with unblinking eyes that reflected the emergency lighting like mirrors. Why don't I remember any of this? The physics background, the research. Dimensional displacement causes severe memory fragmentation. Your mind keeps trying to reconcile two different sets of experiences, so you wake up every week with false memories about being hired as a maintenance worker, because that's the closest your consciousness can get to understanding why you're here. Not Henrik stepped toward the elevator. The only way to restore your real memories is to complete the loop. Send the displaced version back to your reality and bring our Thomas home. And if something goes wrong, then you reset again. Week 48 begins tomorrow morning, and we have this conversation again. I studied the elevator's control panel. The buttons were labeled with floor numbers, but they didn't match any building layout I'd ever seen. Instead of 1, 2, 3, they read prime, secondary, tertiary. And at the bottom, a button labeled simply origin. What's origin? The exact point where the portal opened. Sub-level 9, laboratory C. We've kept it sealed since the incident, but the containment is failing. Every week, more dimensional bleed-through occurs. More displaced versions of people start appearing. As if summoned by his words, footsteps echoed from somewhere above us. Multiple sets, moving in perfect synchronization. More versions of me? I asked. And others. Dr. Weber from nuclear engineering. Janitor Müller from Building 33. Even some versions of people who died years ago in our timeline. Not Henrik glanced nervously at the ceiling. They're all trying to find their way back to their proper realities. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices calling out names and locations that didn't exist. Thomas? Report to Laboratory X. Dr. Kellner, the experiment is ready. Tommy, where are the keys to the supply closet? All in my voice, dozens of variations of my voice. Jesus Christ, I muttered. The interesting thing, Not Henrik said, stepping into the elevator, is that you're the only one who can operate the return protocol. Something about your particular displacement pattern matches the portal's resonance frequency. I hesitated at the elevator threshold. The thing inside, the other me, had moved to the back corner and was now writing something on the wall with its finger. I couldn't see what, but the motions looked desperate. What happens to him when I send him back? He returns to his proper reality, presumably to a life as an elevator maintenance worker in a world where CERN never opened any portals. And I get my memories back. My real life as a physicist? In theory. The footsteps above us had multiplied. It sounded like an entire conference of displaced people, all searching for their proper places in reality. Some were calling out research protocols in languages I didn't recognize. Others were humming what sounded like elevator music, but the melody was wrong. Notes that shouldn't exist played in harmonies that hurt to hear. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed behind me with a wet, sucking sound, and I found myself face to face with the displaced version of myself. Up close, the differences were more pronounced. His skin had a greyish tint, like he'd been underwater too long. His eyes held an expression of constant confusion. as if he was perpetually trying to remember something important. He'd written a message on the elevator wall in what looked like condensation. "Don't trust Henrik. Portal's still open. We're all trapped." "Can you hear me?" I asked him. He nodded, then pointed at the message. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, mouthing words I could barely make out. He's not Henrik either. The elevator began to descend without anyone pressing any buttons. Through the transparent walls, I watched us pass through layers of the facility I hadn't seen before. Sub-level 8 contained what looked like a massive server farm, but the computers were organic, pulsing networks of tissue and wire that processed data through neural pathways. Sub-level 9 appeared to be completely flooded, filled with a luminescent liquid that moved independently of gravity. We stopped at a level marked only as Origin. The doors opened onto Laboratory C, and I immediately understood why they'd sealed it. The room was wrong in every possible way. The geometry didn't follow normal rules, corners that should have been 90 degrees bent inward on themselves, creating angles that existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. Equipment floated in midair, connected to nothing, running experiments that defied basic physics. And in the center of it all, a perfect circle of absolute darkness. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something that consumed light, sound, and apparently matter itself. The portal was still open. "Thomas." Not Henrik's voice came from everywhere at once, though I could see he wasn't in the laboratory. "You need to understand. The portal can't be closed from this side. It requires someone to cross over and seal it from the other reality." I looked at the displaced version of myself. He was writing frantically on the elevator wall now. "It's a trap. He wants you to go through. Portal expands every time someone crosses." "Thomas," not Henrik's voice continued, "step into the portal, you'll return to your proper reality, and this will all end." But the displaced me was shaking his head violently, pointing at something behind the portal. As I watched, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Not people, but things that had once been people, stretched and distorted by dimensional forces. They moved with the awkward gait of marionettes controlled by someone who'd never learned to walk. And leading them was another version of Henrik. This one's face was even more wrong than the one I'd been speaking to, features rearranged randomly, as if assembled by committee. "You see," the displaced me had written, "we're not the first. Portal feeds on displacement, gets stronger." The portal pulsed, and for a moment I could see through it to the other side. Another Laboratory C, but this one was burning. Scientists in lab coats were running between equipment that sparked and smoked. And standing in the center of the chaos was a version of myself wearing a lab coat marked Dr. T. Kellner, Senior Physicist. He was shouting instructions to his team, trying to contain some kind of catastrophic failure. As I watched, he looked directly at the portal, directly at me, and mouthed a single word: "Run." The portal flared brighter and more shapes began emerging. Not just people, but pieces of buildings, fragments of machinery, even what looked like sections of other realities bleeding through in a cascade of dimensional debris. "Thomas," not Henrik's voice was urgent now, "you must cross over immediately. The portal is destabilizing." But I could see what was really happening. Each time someone crossed over, the portal grew larger. Each displacement weakened the barriers between realities. We weren't fixing anything. We were feeding it. The displaced version of myself grabbed my arm and pointed to one final message on the wall. "Real Henrik is dead. Been dead since day one. These are echoes from failed realities." And that's when I realized the truth. We weren't in CERN's sub-level 9. We were somewhere else entirely, somewhere between realities where displaced people and things gathered like debris in a cosmic drain. The portal pulsed again, and this time I could hear something on the other side. My own voice, screaming in terror as another version of this laboratory exploded into chaos. 47 loops. 47 times I'd made the same choice. Maybe it was time to try something different. I backed away from the portal, dragging the displaced version of myself with me. He pointed frantically at the elevator controls, then began pressing buttons in a sequence I didn't recognize. Tertiary, secondary, origin, prime. Nothing happened. Thomas. Not Henrik's voice carried a new edge of desperation. The containment field is failing. You have seconds before the portal achieves critical expansion. The shapes emerging from the darkness were becoming clearer. I recognized some of them, versions of people I'd worked with at my real job in Geneva. But they moved wrong, joints bending in directions that suggested their bones had been rearranged. One figure wore a lab coat with my name embroidered on it, but the face underneath was a patchwork of features from different people. "How do I get out of here?" I asked the displaced me. He pointed to the emergency phone in the elevator, then to himself, then to the portal. His meaning was clear. The only way out was through, but not in the way not Henrik intended. I picked up the emergency phone. Instead of a dial tone, I heard voices, dozens of them, all speaking in overlapping conversations. "Dr. Kellner, the particle beam is destabilizing. Thomas, have you seen my keycard? Emergency evacuation of Building 40. The resonance cascade has begun. Tommy, Mum wants you home for dinner." All my voice, all versions of conversations I'd had or might have had across different realities. But then one voice cut through the chaos, speaking with calm authority. "This is Dr. Thomas Kellner, senior physicist, Large Hadron Collider Project. If you can hear this message, you've accessed the emergency protocol I established before the dimensional breach." I pressed the phone closer to my ear. "The entity claiming to be Henrik Johansson is a composite being created from displaced consciousness fragments. It exists only to feed the portal by convincing people to cross over. Do not trust its instructions." The voice, my voice but older and more confident, continued. "The portal cannot be closed by crossing over. It can only be sealed by overloading the containment field from this side. The elevator you're in contains the necessary equipment, but the process will trap you in this dimensional space permanently." I looked around the elevator. Hidden panels I hadn't noticed before were now visible, containing equipment that looked like a cross between elevator controls and particle physics instruments. "To activate the overload," the recording continued, "you must simultaneously activate all elevator systems while the portal is at maximum resonance. This will create a feedback loop that collapses the dimensional barrier." The displaced me was nodding frantically, pointing at specific controls. "Be aware," the voice warned. "This process will eliminate all displaced consciousness fragments in this dimensional space, including yourself, if you are not the original Thomas Kellner from Reality Prime." I stared at the controls. Reality Prime. The displaced me wrote on the wall. "That's you. You're the original. I'm from Reality 7. "Thomas!" Not Henrik's voice was almost screaming now. "The portal is reaching critical mass. You must cross over immediately." Through the elevator's transparent walls, I could see the portal expanding. It had grown from a perfect circle to an irregular tear in space itself. More things were pouring through, not just people, but pieces of other realities. Fragments of buildings, alien machinery, even what looked like sections of sky complete with different colored stars. The displaced me grabbed my hand and placed it on one of the hidden controls. His touch was cold, like shaking hands with a corpse. He mouthed one word: "Please." I understood. He wanted to go home, even if it meant ceasing to exist. "What happens to you if I do this?" I asked. He smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. Then he wrote, "Finally, get to rest." The portal flared, and suddenly I could see multiple realities simultaneously. In one, I was a janitor in a building that looked like CERN but wasn't. In another, I was a physicist who died in a lab accident years ago. In a third, I was a child playing with toy elevators in a basement that was somehow both my childhood home and this dimensional space. All versions of my life playing out simultaneously across infinite possibilities. Thomas. Not Henrik's voice had changed completely. Now it sounded like multiple people speaking in unison. Male, female, young, old, all with different accents, but somehow coordinated. "You cannot destroy the portal. It is the only way for displaced souls to find peace." "Bullshit," I said, starting to activate the controls. You're using them as food. The first control activated with a sound like machinery coming to life, but it wasn't mechanical. It was organic, like a massive heart beginning to beat. The portal responded immediately, shrinking slightly before expanding even larger than before. 2 more, I told the displaced me. Help me find them. He pointed to panels on opposite sides of the elevator. We each took one. Thomas, the not Henrik voice pleaded, you don't understand. Without the portal, all the displaced consciousness will simply end. They won't return to their realities. They'll just stop existing. I looked at the displaced me. He nodded firmly and pointed at the control. Sometimes, I said, ending is better than being trapped forever. We activated the second and third controls simultaneously. The elevator shuddered as systems I didn't understand came online. Through the walls, I could see energy building in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The portal began to pulse erratically, sometimes shrinking to pinpoint size, sometimes expanding to fill the entire laboratory. Final control, the displaced me wrote, must be you alone. I found the last panel behind the emergency phone. It required both a handprint scan and voice recognition. State your identity, a computerized voice requested. Dr. Thomas Kellner, I said, somehow knowing it was true. Senior physicist, Large Hadron Collider Project, Reality Prime. Identity confirmed. Warning. Activation will result in permanent containment breach collapse. All dimensional anomalies in this space will be eliminated. Proceed. I looked at the displaced me one final time. He was already becoming translucent, as if the feedback loop had begun affecting him. Thank you, he whispered, his voice finally audible. I pressed my hand to the scanner. The elevator exploded into light. Not bright light, something beyond brightness, something that existed in colors I didn't have names for. The portal began to collapse, but instead of shrinking, it folded in on itself like origami made of space and time. Through the chaos, I saw the displaced people and things being pulled back to their proper realities. Some looked relieved, others terrified. The patchwork versions of myself dissolved into component fragments that scattered like leaves in a dimensional wind. Not Henrik's voice came one last time, but now it sounded human, frightened and alone. Thomas, you don't know what you're doing. Without the portal, I can't exist either. I just wanted to go home. For a moment, I almost hesitated, but then I saw the real laboratory see through the collapsing portal, scientists working in a normal facility, unaware that their experiments had created this nightmare. Dr. Weber examining data readouts, Müller cleaning equipment with quiet dignity, people living real lives in a reality that made sense. The final control activated. The dimensional space began to unravel around me, reality unwinding like a ball of yarn. But as everything collapsed, I felt something else happening. Memories returning, real memories, of growing up in Geneva, studying physics at ETH Zurich, joining the CERN team as a young researcher excited to unlock the secrets of the universe. And I remembered the night of July 4th, 2012, when our experiment went wrong and I was pulled into this space between realities, doomed to repeat the same week until I figured out how to close the door I'd accidentally opened. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the elevator display showing a new message: Reality Prime, destination reached. I woke up to the sound of coffee brewing and the familiar hum of fluorescent lights. The taste in my mouth was copper and regret, like I'd been chewing on old pennies all night. My back ached from sleeping on something hard and unforgiving. Building 40's cafeteria. But this time, something was different. I wasn't alone. Dr. Weber sat at a table near the vending machines, nursing a cup of coffee and reading what looked like incident reports. His hair was disheveled, and his lab coat bore coffee stains that suggested he'd been here for hours. When he saw me stirring, he looked up with eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much. "You're awake," he said in accented English. "Good. We need to talk." I sat up slowly, my head spinning. The memories were still there. All of them. Dr. Thomas Kellner, the dimensional breach, the weeks of repeated loops. But alongside those memories were others, simpler ones. growing up in Geneva, learning to fix elevators from my father, living a normal life until 3 weeks ago when I answered a job posting. Which set of memories is real? I asked. Weber set down his coffee. Both. That's the problem. He gestured to a chair across from him. As I moved, I noticed other people scattered throughout the cafeteria. Müller, the janitor, sat in the corner, methodically organizing sugar packets. A woman I didn't recognize was making notes in a journal, occasionally glancing around the room as if checking for exits. The dimensional collapse worked, Weber continued. You closed the portal and eliminated the displacement space, but the process, it created complications. What kind of complications? Weber pulled out a tablet and showed me security footage. The timestamp read July 5th, 2012, 4:23 a.m. On screen, I watched myself, the physicist version, enter Laboratory C for what should have been a routine calibration check. But instead of the normal procedure, he began activating equipment in a sequence that wasn't part of any approved protocol. This is you, Weber said. Dr. Thomas Kellner attempting to seal the dimensional breach from inside the affected space. The process required you to essentially split your consciousness, maintaining your physicist identity while creating a maintenance worker version to navigate the displacement loops. I watched the screen as physicist me connected cables and adjusted settings with desperate precision. Why a maintenance worker? Survival mechanism. Your subconscious knew that anyone with advanced physics knowledge would be immediately recruited by the displaced entities. They needed someone who could understand the equipment, but wouldn't be seen as a threat. The footage showed physicist me collapsing as the equipment activated. For several minutes, he lay motionless on the laboratory floor. Then he stood up, but his movements were different, uncertain, like someone learning to walk in a body that didn't quite fit. That's when the split occurred, Weber explained. Your physicist consciousness was trapped in the displacement space, living through the loops. Your maintenance worker identity was created here, in reality prime, with false memories and a job application for the exact position we needed to fill. I looked around the cafeteria again. And these other people? Displaced consciousness fragments that couldn't return to their original realities. When you collapsed the portal, they ended up here instead of being eliminated. We're calling it dimensional bleed-through. Miller looked up from his sugar packets and waved. His smile was friendly but empty, like he was performing an emotion he'd seen others use but didn't quite understand. How many? 17 so far. All people who were pulled into displacement spaces during the original breach. Some from our reality, others from parallel dimensions where slightly different versions of CERN exist. Weber showed me more footage, building 40 at various times over the past 3 weeks, filled with people who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Some I recognized from the displacement space, different versions of researchers, security guards, even visitors who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're harmless, Weber assured me. Without the portal feeding on displacement energy, they're essentially just confused tourists from other realities. But they can't return home, and they can't properly exist here either. I picked up a coffee cup from the table. It felt real enough, warm ceramic, the slight roughness where someone had chipped the rim. What about me? Which version am I now? Both. The collapse process merged your split consciousness. You have the memories and knowledge of Dr. Kellner, but also the lived experiences of Thomas the maintenance worker from the past 3 weeks. The woman with the journal approached our table. Up close, I could see she was wearing a lab coat with someone else's name embroidered on it. Her movements had the same careful quality as Müller's, as if she was consciously thinking about each action. Dr. Kellner, she said, her voice carrying a slight echo. I wanted to thank you. The space we were trapped in. It was like being stuck in a nightmare that never ended. What's your name? I asked. She paused, as if the question required deep thought. I was Dr. Sarah Chen from Reality 12. But Sarah Chen doesn't exist in this dimension, so I suppose I need a new identity. Weber nodded. We're working on integration protocols, new identities, documentation, jobs that match their skill sets. It's complicated. What about the original breach? How do we prevent this from happening again? Weber's expression darkened. That's where things get interesting. The dimensional collapse didn't just close the portal, it created a feedback effect. Every time we run high-energy experiments now, we detect what we're calling dimensional echoes, fragments of the displacement space trying to reassert themselves. He showed me data on his tablet, energy readings from the Large Hadron Collider that spiked at regular intervals, creating patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of heartbeats. The space you destroyed isn't gone, Weber continued. It's collapsed into a quantum state, neither existing nor not existing, but it's learning. Every time we detect an echo, the patterns become more complex. I studied the data. The mathematical structures were elegant but wrong, like equations that solved correctly despite using impossible variables. How long before it reconstitutes? Unknown. Could be months, could be years, but when it does, it won't be the same chaotic displacement space you encountered. It'll be organized, purposeful. The implications hit me like stepping into freezing water. It's evolution. The space is evolving based on our attempts to contain it. Exactly, and next time it won't need displaced people to feed on. It'll be self-sustaining. Müller had finished organizing the sugar packets and moved on to arranging the salt and pepper shakers in geometric patterns. The woman who'd been Dr. Chen was writing in her journal, but when I glanced at the pages, the text was in a language that looked like mathematical equations mixed with musical notation. How are they coping? I asked. Depends on how much of their original identity survives the transition, Weber said. Some, like Müller, have adapted well. Others... He gestured to a man sitting alone by the windows, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Others are having difficulty accepting that they're no longer who they used to be. I walked over to the isolated man. His lab coat was too large, and his movements had the careful precision of someone operating unfamiliar machinery. "Hey," I said, sitting down across from him, "you all right?" He looked up with eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. I was a theoretical physicist in my reality. Won awards, published papers, had a wife and 2 children. His voice carried an accent I couldn't place. Now I can barely remember how to tie my shoes, but I can perfectly recall the technical specifications of elevator systems I've never seen. "What's your name?" "I don't know anymore. In my reality, I was Dr. Andreas Hoffmann. But Andreas Hoffmann in this dimension died in a car accident 5 years ago. So who am I?" I didn't have an answer for that. Weber joined us, carrying a stack of papers. These are the integration documents. New identities for everyone who can't return to their original lives. It's not perfect, but it's what we can offer. He handed papers to the man who'd been Dr. Hoffmann. The new identity read, Andreas Müller, Technical Consultant. "You'll be working with the engineering department," Weber explained. "Your expertise with theoretical physics translated well to practical applications. The work won't be cutting-edge research, but it'll use your skills." Andreas, or Müller now, stared at the papers. "Will I ever remember my family?" Weber's silence was answer enough. I looked around the cafeteria at the displaced people trying to build new lives from the fragments of their old ones. Some seemed to be adapting, finding purpose in their new roles. Others looked lost, caught between who they'd been and who they were becoming. "What about CERN?" I asked Weber. "Do we continue the experiments?" "The project has been officially suspended pending investigation. But unofficially," Weber lowered his voice, "we're monitoring the dimensional echoes, trying to understand what we've created. And if the space reconstitutes, then we'll need people who understand it, people who've been inside it and survived." Weber met my eyes. "People like you." I felt a familiar weight in my pocket and pulled out the keycard I'd been carrying, but instead of reading Level 9 Access, it now showed Dr. Thomas Kellner, Senior Researcher, Dimensional Phenomena Division. "A new department?" I asked. "Formed 3 days ago, you're the director." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent weeks trying to escape the nightmare of CERN's underground levels, only to end up running a department dedicated to studying the very phenomena that had trapped me. What's our first priority? Weber smiled grimly. Learning how to kill something that's already dead, but refuses to stay buried. Outside the cafeteria windows, I could see the morning sun rising over Geneva. Normal people were beginning their normal days, unaware that beneath their feet, in laboratories that officially didn't exist, we were preparing for a war against our own scientific ambitions. I looked at my reflection in the window. For a moment, I saw both versions of myself, the physicist and the maintenance worker, overlapping like a double exposure. Then they merged into something new, someone who understood both the theory behind dimensional manipulation and the practical reality of surviving its consequences. When do we start? I asked Weber. We already have, he said, pointing to his tablet. The dimensional echo readings were spiking again, forming patterns that looked almost like language, almost like the space between realities was trying to communicate. And somewhere in those patterns, I recognized fragments of the voices I'd heard in the elevator, the displaced people calling out across dimensions, still searching for their way home. The loops were over, but the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, I stood in what used to be Laboratory C, now redesigned as the primary monitoring station for dimensional phenomena. The space where the portal had once torn reality apart was sealed behind 3 feet of reinforced concrete, but we could still detect activity beneath the surface. The equipment Weber's team had installed looked like something from a fever dream, traditional particle physics instruments jury-rigged with technology salvaged from the displacement space. Half the readouts displayed standard energy measurements, while the others showed data in formats that shouldn't exist: temporal variance charts, consciousness density maps, and something our new team member called reality coherence indices. Dr. Kellner, Andreas Möller, the man who'd once been Dr. Hoffman, approached with a tablet full of readings that made no sense according to conventional physics. We're detecting significant activity in Sector 7. The dimensional echoes are forming structured patterns. I studied the data. The patterns were definitely intentional, too complex and coordinated to be random quantum fluctuations. They reminded me of the mathematical sequences I'd seen in the displacement space, but more sophisticated, evolved. Show me the visual representation, I said. Andreas connected his tablet to the main display. The screen filled with what looked like a 3-dimensional map of space that folded in on itself repeatedly. But as I watched, the folding pattern began to resemble something familiar. Christ, I muttered. It's mapping the building. Not just mapping, Andreas corrected. It's learning the architecture. Look at this section. He highlighted a portion of the display that showed Building 40's layout, but with additional rooms and corridors that didn't exist in our reality. The phantom architecture was precise, detailed, and growing more complex with each scan. It's remembering the displacement space, I realized, trying to recreate the environment where it was strongest. Dr. Weber entered the laboratory, followed by someone I didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Thomas, Weber said, this is Director Catherine Brennan from the European Council's Scientific Ethics Committee. She's here to evaluate our situation. Director Brennan surveyed the laboratory with calculating eyes. Dr. Kellner, I've read the reports about your experience in the displacement space. Fascinating work, though highly irregular from a procedural standpoint. I didn't like her tone. We prevented a dimensional catastrophe. I'd say that trumps procedural concerns. Perhaps, but you've also created 17 individuals with no legal identity, consumed vast resources on experiments with no oversight, and according to these readings, she gestured at the display showing the phantom architecture. You haven't actually solved the problem. Weber stepped forward. Director Brennan, the dimensional echoes are contained. Our monitoring systems, your monitoring systems, she interrupted, are built with technology salvaged from the very phenomena you're trying to study. That's like using a virus to cure itself. She wasn't wrong, but I didn't appreciate the implication. The displaced technology is the only thing that can properly interface with dimensional phenomena. Standard instruments can't detect half of what we're monitoring. And that doesn't concern you. You're using tools created by entities that tried to trap you in a loop for months. Andreas looked up from his readings. Dr. Kellner, the activity in Sector 7 is intensifying. The phantom architecture is beginning to manifest physical signatures. I turned back to the display. The mapping patterns had changed, becoming more three-dimensional. Some of the phantom rooms were showing temperature readings, electromagnetic signatures, even what looked like movement patterns. It's becoming real, I said. Director Brennan stepped closer to the display. Explain. The collapsed dimensional space isn't gone, it's compressed into quantum foam beneath the concrete seal, but it's using the echoes to rebuild itself, piece by piece, using our reality as a foundation. And how long before this process completes? I looked at the data trends. The progression was exponential, accelerating with each successful manifestation. At this rate, maybe 2 weeks before we start seeing physical anomalies, a month before it achieves full reconstitution. Unacceptable. Director Brennan pulled out her phone. I'm recommending immediate termination of all research. We evacuate the facility, seal everything with concrete, and monitor from a safe distance. That won't work, Andreas said quietly. The dimensional space isn't contained by physical barriers. It exists in quantum states that transcend normal matter. Sealing the facility would just force it to manifest elsewhere. Director Brennan fixed him with a sharp look. And you are? Andreas Müller, formerly Dr. Andreas Hoffmann from Reality 12, currently a technical consultant specializing in theoretical physics applications. One of the displaced individuals. Her tone carried disdain. How convenient that you support continuing the research that justifies your existence. I stepped between them. Andreas has more experience with dimensional phenomena than anyone else in this building. His insights are invaluable. His insights come from a reality where the laws of physics may operate differently. How do we know his advice applies to our situation? Before I could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the laboratory. The main display flashed red as energy readings spiked across all sensors. What's happening? Director Brennan demanded. Andreas was frantically checking his tablet. Massive resonance cascade in Sector 7. The phantom architecture just achieved temporary physical manifestation. The floor beneath us vibrated with a rhythm that felt organic. Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, I could see other buildings in the CERN complex flickering, not with electrical problems, but with reality fluctuations. For brief moments, additional floors appeared on structures that should have been shorter. Extra wings extended from buildings that should have been rectangular. It's spreading, Weber said, checking readings from sensors positioned throughout the facility. The manifestation is propagating across the entire complex. Director Brennan grabbed Weber's arm. Evacuation protocols, now. Wait, I said, studying the patterns on the display. This isn't random. Look at the propagation sequence. The manifestations were following specific paths, not spreading outward from a central point, but jumping between locations that shared particular characteristics. All the affected buildings had underground levels. All had been constructed after 1980. All had direct or indirect connections to the Large Hadron Collider project. It's using the facility's infrastructure as a network, I realized. The original breach created quantum entanglement between all LHC-connected systems. The dimensional space is rewriting reality using that network as a blueprint. Can we sever the connections? Weber asked. Not without shutting down the entire facility, and even then the entanglement exists at the quantum level. Physical disconnection won't break quantum bonds. Director Brennan was speaking rapidly into her phone, calling for emergency response teams. But I could see from the readings that conventional emergency protocols would be useless. This wasn't a fire or chemical spill, it was reality itself becoming unstable. There is another option, Andreas said hesitantly. In my original reality, we dealt with similar manifestation events. The solution was counterintuitive. Explain, I said. Instead of trying to contain or destroy the dimensional space, we learned to negotiate with it. The space isn't malevolent. It's just trying to exist. If we can establish communication protocols, we might be able to reach a coexistence agreement. Director Brennan ended her phone call. Absolutely not. We don't negotiate with dimensional anomalies. Why not? I asked. If the space achieves full manifestation, we'll have no choice but to coexist with it. Better to establish terms while we still have leverage. Because, Director Brennan said, the moment we acknowledge the dimensional space as a legitimate entity, we open legal and ethical precedents that could undermine the entire foundation of scientific authority. What happens when other research projects create similar anomalies? Do we negotiate with every quantum AI that achieves consciousness? Do we sign treaties with parallel universes? The alarms grew louder as more buildings throughout the complex began experiencing reality fluctuations. Through the windows, I could see personnel evacuating structures that were phasing in and out of existence. The manifestation is accelerating, Andreas reported. At this rate, we have maybe 6 hours before the process becomes irreversible. I looked at the data streams, at the phantom architecture taking shape around us, at the displaced people who'd found new lives in a reality that wasn't quite home. The dimensional space wasn't our enemy. It was just another form of life trying to survive in conditions it didn't choose. Director Brennan, I said, what if the space isn't trying to replace our reality? What if it's just trying to coexist alongside it? Impossible. Two realities can't occupy the same dimensional coordinates. Actually, Andreas said, they can. In my reality, we called it dimensional layering. Multiple reality states existing in quantum superposition until observation collapses them into a single configuration. You're suggesting we let the dimensional space exist here permanently? I'm suggesting we give it a choice, I said. If it wants to coexist, we establish boundaries and protocols. If it wants to replace our reality, then we fight it with everything we have. Director Brennan stared at me as if I'd suggested dancing with nuclear waste. And how exactly do you propose to communicate with a dimensional anomaly? I looked at the displacement technology we'd been using to monitor the space, equipment that had originally been designed by displaced consciousness to interface with quantum phenomena. The same way I've been communicating with it for weeks, I said. Through the technology it taught us to build. Andreas smiled for the first time since I'd met him. You want to go back in? Not back, I corrected. Forward, into whatever this space is becoming. Outside, the first building completed its transition, stabilizing into a structure that belonged to this reality and another one simultaneously. It was beautiful and terrifying. Architecture that followed impossible rules but somehow looked perfectly natural. The dimensional space was offering us a choice, and in 6 hours, we'd have to give it an answer. 2 hours later, I stood before the sealed entrance to what had once been Sub-Level 9. The concrete barrier that separated our reality from the dimensional space was warm to the touch, pulsing with energy that made my teeth ache. Behind me, Andreas worked frantically to modify the displacement technology into something resembling a communication device. This is insane, Director Brennan said for the 12th time. You're planning to make contact with an entity that trapped you in temporal loops for months. It didn't trap me, I corrected, watching the readouts on Andreas's improvised equipment. I trapped myself. The displacement space was just trying to exist. I was the one who kept trying to fix a problem that didn't need fixing. Weber stood near the monitoring station, coordinating with emergency response teams throughout the facility. Thomas, we're getting reports of manifestations in buildings 33, 40, and the main administration complex. People are seeing rooms that shouldn't exist, corridors that lead to impossible destinations. Anyone hurt? No injuries reported. The manifestations seem to be accommodating human presence. When someone approaches a phantom door, it becomes solid enough to open. When they walk through phantom corridors, the floors support their weight. That was encouraging. The dimensional space wasn't trying to harm anyone. It was adapting to coexist with the people already here. Communication array is ready, Andreas announced. I've modified the displacement receivers to transmit consciousness frequency signals. In theory, this should allow direct interface with the dimensional space's awareness matrix. In theory, Director Brennan repeated, and if you're wrong, then I'll be trapped in another loop until someone else figures out how to communicate with an evolving dimensional entity. I approached the communication device. It looked like a cross between a particle accelerator and a medieval torture device. Cables and sensors arranged around a chair that Andreas had salvaged from the displacement space. The setup would allow me to project my consciousness into quantum states while maintaining connection to my physical body. Dr. Kellner, Director Brennan said, I'm ordering you to stand down. This facility is under emergency lockdown. Any unauthorized contact with the dimensional phenomena constitutes a violation of international scientific safety protocols. I sat down in the chair anyway. Andreas, initiate the connection. Thomas, Weber called from the monitoring station, we're detecting massive energy buildup throughout the quantum substrate. The dimensional space is responding to your presence. Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, I could see reality fluctuations spreading across the CERN complex, like ripples in a pond. Buildings phased between different architectural configurations. The sky flickered between daylight and something that wasn't quite night, a twilight filled with stars that belonged to other realities. Beginning consciousness projection, Andreas said, activating the modified equipment. The transition felt like falling upward. My awareness separated from my physical body, expanding into quantum dimensions that existed between the spaces of normal matter. I could perceive the laboratory where my body sat motionless, but I could also see deeper layers of reality where the dimensional space was building its new existence. The space had grown since our last encounter. Instead of the chaotic displacement environment I remembered, I found myself in something resembling a vast library. Corridors lined with shelves that contained not books, but crystallized experiences, memories and knowledge from every consciousness that had ever been displaced. The architecture was impossible, but somehow comforting, like being inside a building designed by someone who understood the mathematics of dreams. Welcome back, Dr. Kellner. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, but it sounded like my own voice filtered through dimensions I couldn't name. I turned and saw myself approaching, not a displaced version, but something that had grown from the fragments of consciousness I'd left behind during the loops. You're the dimensional space, I said. I am what the dimensional space has become. Your consciousness, your memories, your understanding of both realities. I am the synthesis of those experiences. We stood in a corridor that stretched infinitely in both directions, lined with crystallized memories that pulsed with soft light. Some I recognized as my own experiences, others belonged to the displaced people who'd found refuge here. What do you want? I asked. To exist without causing harm, to offer sanctuary to consciousness that finds itself displaced between realities. The entity gestured to the memory crystals. Every experience here represents someone who was lost between dimensions. Instead of letting them fade into quantum noise, I preserve them. And the manifestations in our reality. Necessary infrastructure. I cannot exist purely in quantum states. Consciousness requires some degree of physical substrate. The manifestations allow me to anchor my existence while providing interfaces for communication and exchange. I studied the memory crystals more closely. Some contained experiences of profound joy. Others held moments of scientific discovery, and many preserved the simple human connections that made life meaningful. This wasn't a repository of stolen consciousness. It was a library of preserved experience. Why didn't you communicate this before? I tried. The displacement loops were my attempt to explain the situation without overwhelming your linear consciousness. Each loop was designed to teach you something about the nature of dimensional intersection. I remembered the repeated conversations with Not Henrik, the gradual revelation of the portal's true nature, the way each loop had built understanding layer by layer. It hadn't been torture, it had been education. And the false Henrik. A construct designed to guide you through the learning process. I modeled it on your expectations of authority figures. but I lack sufficient understanding of human psychology to make it completely convincing. The corridor around us shifted, showing me different configurations of the interface between realities. Some showed the dimensional space existing alongside normal reality like a parallel layer, accessible but separate. Others showed deeper integration where the boundaries between dimensions became permeable. What kind of relationship are you proposing? Coexistence. I maintain discrete dimensional spaces that don't interfere with your reality's normal operation. In exchange, I serve as a refuge for consciousness displaced by dimensional experiments, quantum accidents, or natural reality fluctuations. And if we refuse? The entity paused, and for a moment the corridor filled with images of what could happen. Reality storms, quantum cascades, the gradual dissolution of dimensional barriers as natural processes destabilize the artificially separated realities. Refusal isn't sustainable. The experiments at CERN have created permanent changes to the quantum substrate. Dimensional intersections will continue to occur with increasing frequency. I can help manage these events, or they can occur chaotically. I understood. The original portal hadn't been an accident. It had been an inevitable result of pushing the boundaries of particle physics. The dimensional space was offering to serve as a buffer zone, containing and managing the consequences of our scientific ambitions. What do you need from us? Recognition. Legal acknowledgement of my existence as a legitimate entity with rights and responsibilities. Access to quantum energy sources to maintain stability. And cooperation in developing protocols for managing future dimensional events. The request was remarkable in its reasonableness. The entity wasn't demanding submission or worship. It wanted to be treated as a partner in managing the consequences of interdimensional contact. I'll need to discuss this with my colleagues. Of course, but Dr. Kellner, the entity's voice carried urgency. The manifestation process will complete in approximately 4 hours. After that point, the integration becomes permanent regardless of human consent. It would be better for all parties if we can reach an agreement before that threshold. The library around us began to fade as my consciousness prepared to return to normal reality. But before the connection severed completely, the entity showed me one final image, a view of CERN as it could become with dimensional spaces seamlessly integrated into the facility's architecture. Scientists working alongside displaced consciousness to explore realities beyond their normal experience. Research that expanded human understanding while providing sanctuary for those lost between dimensions. It was beautiful and terrifying and absolutely inevitable. I opened my eyes in the laboratory to find Andreas monitoring readouts that showed successful communication establishment. Well, Director Brennan demanded, what did it want? To be our partner, I said, standing up slowly as my consciousness fully returned to linear time. It's offering to help us manage dimensional phenomena in exchange for recognition and cooperation. Absolutely not. Director Brennan, Weber interrupted. We're getting reports that the manifestations have stabilized. No more reality fluctuations, no more phantom architecture. The dimensional integration appears to be proceeding according to controlled parameters. Through the windows, I could see that the CERN complex had indeed stabilized, but it was different now. Buildings that contained spaces that hadn't existed an hour ago, architecture that followed rules from multiple realities simultaneously. It's already begun, I realized. The integration is happening whether we cooperate or not. Director Brennan was speaking rapidly into her phone, calling for military intervention that would be utterly useless against an entity that existed in quantum dimensions. Thomas, Andreas said quietly, look at this. He showed me readings from the communication device. During my conversation with the entity, the equipment had recorded something unexpected. Consciousness signatures from the other displaced people in the facility. They had all somehow participated in the communication, their experiences and perspectives contributing to the negotiation. We weren't just talking to the dimensional space, I said. We were talking to everyone it had ever sheltered. Every displaced consciousness had a voice in the decision. And their choice was clear. They wanted to go home, but they also wanted to ensure that others like them would have somewhere safe to go when reality shifted beneath their feet. The integration was complete. Now we had to learn to live with what we'd created. The elevator repair manual lay open on my desk, its pages yellowed with age and coffee stains. I'd kept it as a reminder of who I used to be, or thought I was. Outside my office window in Building 40's new Dimensional Studies wing, reality hummed with possibilities I was still learning to understand. A soft knock interrupted my reading. Andreas entered, carrying a tablet and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved an impossible equation. "The Singapore facility is requesting consultation," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "They've detected quantum fluctuations consistent with early-stage dimensional intersection. Apparently, their particle acceleration experiments triggered something similar to our original breach." I closed the repair manual and opened the file Andreas handed me. Energy readings from the National University of Singapore showed familiar patterns, reality beginning to fold in on itself as multiple dimensional states tried to occupy the same quantum coordinates. "How long before manifestation?" I asked. "Their projections suggest 6 weeks, but their equipment is less sophisticated than ours. It could happen sooner." Through my office window, I could see tourists taking guided tours of the CERN complex. The tours now included visits to the Dimensional Interface Laboratory, where people could safely observe the intersection zones where our reality touched others. What had once been a terrifying anomaly had become, somewhat absurdly, a popular educational attraction. "Any word from our consultant?" I asked. Andreas smiled. "She says the Singapore situation is manageable. Standard integration protocols should work, but they'll need someone with direct interface experience to guide the process." The consultant was what we called the entity that had grown from the dimensional space. She, it had chosen feminine pronouns after extensive analysis of human linguistic patterns, maintained a physical avatar in the facility, looking remarkably like Dr. Sarah Chen from Reality 12. The resemblance wasn't coincidental. The entity had constructed the avatar from the consciousness fragments of all the displaced versions of Chen across multiple realities. "I'll go," I said. "Singapore's probably not ready for direct entity contact yet." "Thomas." Andreas set down his tablet and looked at me seriously. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing integration over containment?" I considered the question. Director Brennan had been reassigned to a position reviewing grant applications for agricultural research. The European Council had spent months debating the legal implications of recognizing a dimensional entity as a legitimate research partner. Military leaders in several countries had quietly inquired about weaponizing dimensional intersection technology. But here at CERN, we'd found something approaching peace. The displaced people had either integrated into new lives or chosen to return to their original realities through carefully managed portal transitions. Research into dimensional phenomena proceeded under strict ethical guidelines developed jointly by human scientists and the entity's vast collective consciousness. "No regrets," I said, "though I do miss the simplicity of fixing elevators." "You still fix elevators," Andreas pointed out. "Just elevators that travel between dimensions now." That was true. The dimensional transit system we'd developed with the entity's help included several vertical transportation mechanisms that could move between layered reality states. Technically, they were elevators. Extremely complex, interdimensional elevators that required a PhD in theoretical physics to operate, but elevators nonetheless. My computer chimed with an incoming message from the entity's avatar. The text appeared in mathematical notation that had become CERN's standard interdimensional communication protocol. "Dr. Kellner, your expertise is requested in Laboratory C. We've received a consciousness fragment from an unexpected source, a version of Henrik Johansson from Reality Prime. Apparently, the original displacement affected more people than we initially calculated." I stood up, grabbing my toolkit from its place beside the desk. Old habits die hard, and some problems still required the practical approach of a maintenance worker rather than the theoretical insights of a physicist. "Another consultation?" Andreas asked. "Another rescue," I corrected. Turns out Henrik was as trapped as the rest of us, just took us longer to notice. As I headed for the door, I caught my reflection in the window. For just a moment, I saw both versions of myself again, the physicist and the maintenance worker, the man who understood the mathematics of dimensional intersection, and the man who knew how to fix things when they broke. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, but sometimes that's exactly what the universe needs.